block of our summit, where we have a lot of exciting new stuff to share with you. Our first speaker for this block will be Professor Patrick Treacy. He's a dermatological surgeon specializing in dermopathology and the aesthetic medicine. He's founder, owner, and a medical director of Aylesbury Clinics in both Dublin and Cork. He's international known lecturer, author of many scientific research, articles, books. I actually got one as a gift today, so thank you, Patrick. And he'll be sharing his overview of mental wellness as a new chapter in today's medicine. Patrick?
Well, thank you, Thomas, for that, and for inviting me to Prague. And during the period that we were here, Aylesbury won top clinic in Ireland for the 8th year in a row last night.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah. And we're up again tonight, so that's good. And this is part of the future you're looking at. We were speaking earlier with Dr. Hogg from Munich, and we're talking about longevity, and absolutely the clinics of the future will be mental wellness, longevity, and the whole start of it is with the new generation, exosomes, secretomes, and all the rest. So what is mental wellness? It's obviously the absence of a physical disease, and it's more how people fit into society, how they can cope with stress, how they can cope with relationships. And I think I just got some messages from India there where we're doing a big regenerative thing. The East do this so much better than the West, from the point of view that I suppose the West is left with a lot of financial responsibilities, loneliness, people leaving families, and in the East they have this continual, I suppose, association with family and with the absence of loneliness. And even in all our religious texts, be it the Bible, the Torah, the Quran, the people who went into the wilderness, or the people who eat locusts and mist for years, they were all the people who developed hallucinations. John the Baptist, he was the very one that, had been in the wilderness for years and then came out preaching in Nebuchadnezzar. And a lot of the things that we have on earth today, the conflict in Palestine, in Israel, are related directly to the people who directed those things. Anyway, let's get on. That's me, per se. Mental wellness, I was explaining what it is. Then the importance of this in aesthetics. It's so important in aesthetics from the point of view that the holistic approach that Sharina mentioned earlier is what we should look at. If a person comes to us with mental illness, BDD, whatever, their response to how we treat them is totally dependent on their mental health, mental wellness. And when we look at it the other way around, a lot of people who come to us feel bad and they want to feel better within society, how people relate to them and all the rest. And the interesting thing is, if we look at some of the original works in psychiatry and that, you have, would say, The Ascent of Man. A much more important book, 1847 in London, is when they went and noted how animals, particularly monkeys, related to other monkeys. And we know this when we inject Botox. We've got a situation where we are not only changing how the person looks, but how somebody responds to them. So the whole link between mental health and aesthetics has been there for a long, long time. And some of the original studies were back 100 years ago when they put pencils in people's mouth and made them sort of look happy. When they went into a party that was very boring, the people who had the pencils in their mouth thought the party was so much better than the other people who knew it was boring. And from this we know, and I wrote a paper on it many years ago, the Botox Paradise, or Paradox rather, that you have a situation where people actually don't smile because they feel happy. It's when they smile, they release serotonin and it makes them happy. So it's actually the other way around completely. And they used this many years ago in psychiatric hospitals as a means of admitting people for melancholia. If they looked sad per se, they had actually images and figures where they would admit people to hospital. And we know this particularly from when we're doing Botox. We see the omega sign on somebody's head. That fixation that we see just when they contract their cervical muscles, if it's there permanently, it'll lead to melancholia, believe it or not. And when you go into a hospital and you see people looking sad, it's the way their muscles are that makes them sad, not the other way around. And we've had that wrong for so long. Anyway, I better get through this lecture. So, aesthetic medicine and mental health have been together for so many, many years. And the books I mentioned earlier, believe it or not, was Charles Darwin. The most important book in psychiatry for 100 years was written by Charles Darwin. And most of his, I suppose, theories, we were able to bring to fruition, including the facial feedback loop mechanism theory, which we have in Botox. A lot of my work on Botox and depression, believe it or not, was taken up by the Chinese and not by Western medicine. And the Chinese associate me with that and give me a big award regarding that only 2 years ago, but that's another day's work. You think psychiatrists, all they have to do is to inject the glabellar, and this has been showed by Hofenstadt, by Heidelberg Institutes in Munich also actually, Hasselblad did it there, that sort of if you tox the cervical area, people will feel better on a Beck's inventory score, and this costs nothing, and it lasts for like 4.5 months. Anyway, I better keep going. So mental health is more than the absence of mental illness. 50% of, I said, patients, that study, when I looked at it, it isn't really deep major depression. It's people suffering from anxiety, stress, that type of thing, and it's 50% of people. Believe it or not, I've been looking at the brain in a moment to reckon that 50% of this audience also will suffer from some neurological disorder, be it Alzheimer's as they get older, be it Parkinson's, 50%. Now this is important because it brings in inflammation, which is inflammation of the brain and how we can deal with it. Now, when we looked at the things that are associated with mental health, we said social isolation is a massive one. How you deal with stress, be it financial or otherwise. I think one of the best ways of looking at it is if you take a person in the room. Where did they start off? X and Y chromosomes. So first you've got genetics. And genetics is what your parents give to you. I traveled once with David Bowie on the Serious Moonlight Tour, actually through Germany, through most of it, down to Munich. In another life I had to leave Munich and go to Turkey, but I was there on his tour for 3 of the concerts. His grandmother came from very near me in Ireland, and she brought schizophrenia into the family, and his brother Terry, remember, committed suicide in 1984, the very next year. So we start off there, genetics influence mental health. Then we have the cell itself. So the cell is going to have physiological changes within it, and if we think of our brain a bit like a computer chip, if we overload it, we will have to do something in terms of descrambling it, and the next speaker, my friend from Turkey, will tell us one of the ways of doing this. So you've got genetic influences, you've got the physiological influence in the cell, and of course then you've got the person and what they're dealing with in life. particularly if they're dealing with things like financial problems, if they're dealing cultural problems make a big difference. I deal with different problems around the world, particularly in Africa, where I'll be in a few weeks' time, and in Gaza, where I'll be at Christmas. And the cultural influences on people really affect their mental health and how they affect society. And religious influences particularly play a big role on this. So we looked at the cell, the person, and then how the environment affects it. So mental health, all of those things were of course related to COVID, because in COVID we had a situation where families were separated, people were isolated, they couldn't move anywhere, and social isolation is one of the biggest things, and Shirima mentioned this later in life, when sort of we end up losing most of the people we know. Access to care, of course, meant that the hospitals weren't able to see the patients, and telemedicine really came into its part. This has become really big in India, where I'm slightly associated with it through one of their software programs. More so it's fallen off again a bit with us. Economic strain, obviously people lost their work, and we had a situation, I suppose, where, at least in Ireland, these sort of signs come out, the signs of mental health at work. In other words, if you're not able to cope properly, you're not receiving supporting information, you don't understand your role, don't engage with the workforce, this is all directly. This is just one of my patients, many patients. During the period, the two big things I've seen after COVID, that's just an advancement flat for a basal cell carcinoma. It's something that I would do on a daily basis. But we've seen 66 squamous cell carcinomas in the period of post-COVID patients. They were all advanced because people couldn't reach the hospitals. The other big thing we seen was migraines. And in the period, the first 3 weeks after lockdown, we did, I think it was 38 migraine treatments for patients that were isolated in Ireland. Some of them would normally be going to the UK, from Northern Ireland, and they sort of came to us. Trauma and grief, of course. So these are the things I mentioned earlier: social isolation, economic strain, health fears, trauma and grief, increased awareness. That was just from one of the Irish papers, but from all around the world, this became a major topic in the post-COVID period. Now, the interesting thing is that if we look at stress and depression, the UK is running pretty high, about 39, 40, pretty much the same as America. Germany is much lower. The interesting thing, China is only 14%, which is interesting. And we have all were told about the great lockdown in China and how it's affecting the people in that. The results don't seem to sort of stand up with that. So in terms of mental wellness, these are studies from the UK. 74% are stressed or unable to cope. There's extra things in Britain, obviously, like Brexit and the economy falling apart a bit compared to Ireland, but anyway, I'm really joking. 62% of the world's population have problems sleeping, and one of the great things that EXOMIND tends to do is actually make people sleep better. There's no doubt about that. We ran some studies on it, and everybody reported back that they slept better after it. And in the world, nearly 500 million have a diagnosis of depression from psychiatric hospitals. As I said, I was associated a bit with Gaza, Nasser Hospital, and that's just the text on the thing, some of the doctors saying, at least the war has ended. We helped the dermatology departments get some medications. With the help of our Israeli colleagues, I must say, as dermatologists, they helped us, and the World Health Organization. I only mention it because mental health was one of the big things on their walls just in the COVID period. Obviously, there's more things to deal with now. So within life, we've got obviously pressure from career, finances, disconnection, and these are the things here which affect our quality of life per se. where's my timer? Let's see just where I am.
Oh, there.
It's gone missing, has it? Oh, I'm sorry, it's okay. Lots of time. Okay, good. Thanks, Thomas. So, in terms of mental health, emotional stability is important, adaptability to change, decision making, and these are all things that work from the cognitive function, left prefrontal cortex area, that the EXOMIND that my colleague will be talking about in a moment can work on immediately. Maintaining self-control, motivation and focus, stress management, maintaining positive relationships. That's an important one, believe it or not. Depression and inability to cope directly affect relationships, both ways. And in your ability to pursue goals and passions. So most people in this room, because they're here with an ability to formulate their future and they're looking towards buying different devices and all the rest, that's a very positive thing to have in life. Because usually people, once they become affected by mental wellness, that coping ability is one of the things that disappears. It's called anhedonia. And when we were talking earlier about diseases and people living in isolation, some of the diseases that we had years ago that we have still worse, acedia was actually a psychological condition which we had for almost 1,000 years or more, where people who went into isolation developed mental illness. And this is very important because Charles Dickens went to Pennsylvania in the 1870s, and they had brought in this new method of treating prisoners by leaving them for 23 to 24 hours of social isolation. And all the people actually started going mad. And as a consequence, he wrote one of his important books on his trip to America. And as a consequence of that book, they stopped doing that in 1873 in Pennsylvania. And it's just interesting when you look, you know, sort of all the things are there in life, and things like COVID actually exacerbate them. COVID hasn't been bad for everybody. Come on, we got digitalization of our currencies. It's great, we can pay for everything on our phones now. And I was in South Africa recently, and it's a good tip because in South Africa, obviously there's a lot of crime, you get your money stolen very easily. Bring 2 phones. One that sort of you can give when they steal it, and the other one where you've got all your money. So I mean, that whole fantastic digitalization, I mean, I haven't carried currency in quite a while now. The aesthetic market, believe it or not, and the mental illness market, if we look at them commercially, the mental illness market is 10 times bigger than the aesthetic market. And as our colleagues, and particularly Sharima's first lecture is, when we look at the future, it'll be, there's no doubt about it, longevity within medicine, and the aesthetic clinics are well suited to take this up. And not only that, but obviously mental health comes into it. So the way I want you to look at it is this: hospitals deal with degenerative medicine. They deal with organ failure and all the rest. Their life is spent making things that are gone wrong better. We deal with regenerative medicine. In other words, we take people that are normal-ish, most of them, and we either sort of make them want to live longer or live better. And as a consequence, the aesthetic market is perfectly poised to do this. Now, I'm asked all the time to join these clinics in Dubai and all the rest that are injecting IV exosomes and making people live longer. And that's fine, that will happen. But what we've got to do is control the cargo. Most of what we read about exosomes actually is based on hype. There's no FDA approval, there's no proper things. But if we look at what's happening, we're taking what's happening within the cell and giving it back to ourselves. But if we think for a moment, with all the microRNA and everything within the vesicle, if we can change the cargo within, then we've control of everything. We'll make bad hearts better, we'll make bad pancreases better, and that is the future. And the generation after us, there's no doubt about it, will use that technology to make people live to 120. I have absolutely no doubt about that. And the thing is, there's nobody who wants to live to 120 that suddenly develops Alzheimer's at 99 and they'll spend the next things. Now, you've got to think something else. In terms of our brains and all the rest, in the late 1950s, we suddenly developed autoimmune diseases. Pretty big. They all came on board then, even though we could measure ANAs from the 1920s. In that whole period, and I want you to think about it, we had the rise of Alzheimer's, we had the rise of everything, sort of all the rheumatic joint illnesses and all the rest. And three of the things that will change the future, particularly of imaging, is photobiomodulation, where we can use infrared to sort of reach the skull to make this better. The EXOMIND or TMS, that will also reduce inflammation to an extent, but reset pathways. And the third thing is grounding. The earth is negative, we're positive. We know for a fact that these things all happened from almost 1957 onwards. And I want you to think for a moment, why did that happen? We know that in terms of grounding, people who put those things in their bed at night time or take off their shoes. By the way, you're supposed to take off your shoes for at least 20 minutes. We know that the inflammatory markers, the cytokines, the interleukins, all drop as a consequence of grounding yourself. And we think what has happened is when we changed from leather shoes to rubber shoes, and with the introduction of sneakers, suddenly for almost 12 hours a day, we're separated from the earth, we're building up positive charge within ourselves that can't discharge. But anyway, I better go on. We went through most of that, societal pressures. And it's across the board, teachers, doctors, nurses, accountants, all presenting with mental health problems. Now, we know that if you don't sleep, this directly affects the HPA, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, and as a consequence, you're going to have raised CRHs and also ACTH, and as a consequence, that's going to break down collagen. So people who are stressed, their skin is thinner, and that has been well proven. People who don't sleep, the skin is thinner. And as a consequence, the rise of cortisol within the body will give rise to lack of keratinocytes. And I did a lot of work on this, particularly with a thing that's called the Dublin Lift. And I got an award in Cambridge University only a few weeks ago for being the forerunner of a lot of regenerative medicine. We were among the first, if not the first, to use PRP in 2007. We won awards for the London on hair growth. And then with some of my other techniques, the plush technique, where we added stem cells. And believe it or not, stem cells, if you inject them, don't work. We thought there was great hope for hearts being better, spinal cords being better, but the results from Tel Aviv and that were, they do work to an extent. New York showed myocardial, I'm out of time, getting better. And one of the things we did was introduce red light with stem cells. And as a consequence, it changed the biological function and directed them, and we were able to regrow epidermal tissue, particularly in vascular occlusions and burns. And the hospital started sending us cases, which was nice, and people didn't have to get skin grafts, but that's another day's work. My lecture's over, actually, is it? Or do you want me to keep going?
You get one more slide?
Yeah, okay, right. So the current treatment options for, I suppose, people who have poor mental health are antidepressants, stress management, obviously, psychotherapy, and then different apps, and of course, EXOMIND, we'll be looking at in a moment. So, inflammation within the body is good. There's no doubt about it. We know that that prevents us getting infections, that prevents us getting scar tissue. But what happens is it's uncontrolled. And we think one of the reasons is because of the positive charge that we have in our body, maintaining it. Only recently, in Stanford University, they discovered that within fat, the M2s and the macrophages are the main cause of now us aging. Believe it or not, that what happens is when they drop off, the control inflammation drops off also, and as a consequence we get this chronic inflammation making us older, which is called inflammaging, which is aging and inflammation together. So think that if you are doing even liposuction and fat grafting, if you maintain those cells in a fridge and give it to somebody 20 years later, they will still have the M2 macrophages. So this is a whole new world. We're living at the wrong time. It'll be interesting in about 50 years' time where we are. So unfortunately, inflammation within the body is the cause of the 15 top causes of death in Europe. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, respiratory diseases, all of them are underpinned by chronic inflammation. So if you were to do anything in life, preserve your brain going forward. There's no doubt about that. So the things you've got to know as well, I suppose you want to read up on this, is glial cells. Glial cells are the brain's unsung heroes. You'll hear more and more of them. They maintain a role in inflammaging that'll go forward. So it's pity this lecture isn't a little longer, but I'm going to hand over to my colleague from Turkey, Professor, to look at one of the ways we can reduce mental health, improve mental wellness, obviously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Treacy, for giving us the intro talk on the field of the mental wellness. Now, the next lecture